Take our viewers live now to the Prime Minister at the War Memorial.
Greatest role of war correspondents, indeed of all journalists, and that is to stand up to the powerful, to hold up the truth to power. It is often said that in war the first casualty is the truth, and it is the war correspondents that have to tell the truth, often in the face of considerable criticism. It takes courage for any journalist, for any correspondent, to stand up to big businesses, to vested interests, to governments, and never more so in a time of war, when of course all of the arguments of patriotism can be levelled, inveighed against a journalist who seeks to tell the truth. And so it is wonderfully fitting that we, a great democracy, one of the world's greatest democracies, is dedicating this memorial on the centenary of Keith Murdoch's letter to Andrew Fisher. Because what Keith Murdoch did, an Australian journalist, a war correspondent, what he did was tell the truth. He told the truth in the nation's interest. He told uncomfortable truths. Because, my friends, our democracy depends not just on the politicians, not just on the judges. It depends on our armed services defending our freedoms, but it depends vitally on a free press, on a free and courageous press, on free and courageous correspondents who are not cowed by governments and by big vested interests. Now, we have had a very long tradition of courageous journalists covering our nation's wars. They have, as Brendan said, drafted written the first draft of history. Arguably the first war correspondent, arguably the world's first historian, was of course Thucydides, who was a participant in the Peloponnesian War, although I'd say to the admirals and the generals he was also a general, so he was multitasking. Perhaps that wouldn't be allowed, wouldn't be acceptable nowadays. Can I say that it is wonderful that the Charles Bean Foundation has sponsored this, has created this memorial, because Charles Bean broke the mould of what had been like Keith Murdoch, he broke the mould of the war correspondent that in effect becomes part of the military's or the government's publicity machine. And some of his, as those of you that have read Ross Coulthart's excellent book would know very well, some of his dispatches were rejected because they were not jingoistic enough. They strayed too close to the facts, to telling the full horror of what was going on. So this is a memorial about courage in the face of death, courage in the face of physical threat, but it is also a memorial to the courage of men and women who do what is so essential in our democracy, hold up the truth to power, and at a time when the power is more powerful than it ever can be. That is when governments are at their most powerful and the pressure they can exert on a free press is the greatest. So we are talking today about a tradition of courage, a tradition that is absolutely fundamental to our democracy. Now we remember war correspondents who were killed doing their work. Damien Pera, who died with a camera in his hand, like Bruce Piggott, John Cantwell and Michael Birch, who were killed in Vietnam. Neil Davis, who filmed his own death while covering a coup in Bangkok, and Paul Moran from the ABC, who died in Iraq. And of course, as Brendan noted, Shirley Shackleton is here, the widow of Greg, who together with his 4 colleagues, television reporters and cameramen, who were killed in Balibo 40 years ago. The trauma of covering war is considerable. We we should not forget that. And I would just record or repeat what the Australian journalist Michael Ware wrote about returning to what was supposed to be a normal life after covering the war in Iraq. And I'm quoting from his work. He said, I felt chewed and spat out by my past employers. In the field, it was only a colleague, a mate and a true brother in arms with me everywhere who helped me at all. And then in New York, two other friends, both cameramen, discreetly found the doctor I went on to see in secret for almost 2 years. His bills came out of my pocket. No recompense from those who paid me for my wars. From them came only rebuke and lectures. Bean, of course, was originally offered the role of chief censor, and he rejected that and instead became our chief journalist. He wrote the first draft of history, and then, in many respects, well, there's never the final draft is never written, but he wrote a very advanced draft as well. I mentioned Thucydides earlier, the Athenian general and writer who wrote his history of the Peloponnesian Wars. And you know, when you reflect on how Bean was chastised by editors for not being romantic enough in his coverage, and often reproached himself for not having enough poetry in his copy, and preferring to set out the facts. I can just quote to you from Thucydides' work 2,500 years ago, and he wrote, "The absence of romance in my history will, I fear, detract somewhat from its interest, but if it be judged useful by those who desire an exact knowledge of the past as an aid to the interpretation of the future, I shall be content." So there is a long thread of telling the truth from Thucydides right down to our war correspondents of today. Now, we also have with us Peter Grester. Peter Grester's courage and his dedicating to telling the truth and paying a very heavy price for us is understood by us all. And I want Peter, as I said to you yesterday, you to know that the Australian government continues to support you and your colleagues, and we will continue to press the government of Egypt to pardon you and the other journalists with whom you worked, and that are still imprisoned in Egypt. So finally, friends, I want to acknowledge the support of the benefactors here today, particularly those in the Australian media, and without running the very grave risk for any politician to single out one part of the media over another, I cannot help but note our friend Kerry Stokes, whose generosity is one of Australia's greatest philanthropists, and his generosity to the memorial is truly remarkable and a great example to all of us. I want to thank the War Memorial itself, led by Dr. Nelson, for the great care they've given to the creation of this memorial and their dedication to protecting and preserving Australia's heritage. And finally, may I just conclude where I began. We are one of the oldest democracies in the world. Our democracy depends on many men and women, on many institutions, all of them vitally important, but none is more important than a free and courageous press. And today we are honouring the war correspondents, but in doing so we are honouring the freedom they have worked so hard to preserve. Thank you very much.
Malcolm Turnbull there. We're going to be interviewing him at 10:30 Eastern. David Spears will be interviewing Mr Turnbull. Just quickly and finally, we've got Peter Jennings, the Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. We've been cut short.